Great. First speaker in this session is Ioannis Kevrekidis, who's the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor in Departments of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering and Applied Math and Statistics and Department of Urology at Johns Hopkins and Emeritus Professor of Chemical and Biological Engineering at Princeton. And we're very happy to have him presenting a talk, Learning Dynamical Systems from Data, Things We Knew in the 90s and Things We Learn Now.
First, thank you very much for the invitation. Second, is there another speaker in this session?
There is.
Because in the program, I didn't have one. Okay, good. Thank you.
Yes, you have 30 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is a slightly changed title, and this is a talk that is kind of different from the ones this afternoon. And it's the work of many people, and I want to share both some old stuff with you, and then I want to say a few things that we're excited about now. This mostly has to do with doing dynamical models for complex systems. And as you heard, I already am kind of emeritus one. So you may know that the typical joke, the old professor said, all of this is wrong, and I published it first anyway. So there is a bunch of stuff that was very interesting in learning dynamical systems from data in the 90s, and I wanted to show you a few of these things because some of them are interesting, and then there is some new directions for some of this work. This is work, as I said, over many years, including back then, and also more recently. So for a long time, we've tried to work in my group on problems that have to do with complex multi-scale problems, and we did something that we called equation-free stuff, and I will explain this briefly. And the idea is that machine learning is something that helps you create models for complex systems based on data. In our case, the data come usually from a fine-scale, stochastic, microscopic, molecular, agent-based code. The idea is that there exist macroscopic descriptions. It's just that you're not smart enough to write them down. So you don't have the Navier-Stokes, you have molecular dynamics. You don't have chemical kinetics, you have molecular dynamics. You don't have chemotactic equations, you have agent-based models, and you get the data from a fine-scale code, and you're trying to be predictive at the macro scale. So here is a very simple model that comes from plankton modeling. It's from a friend, Tony Roberts, a very bright Australian mathematician. And the main point from this problem is not so much its details, but to show you these two movies side by side. There are two movies of the same thing. One is micro, one is macro. On the left, you see initially 20,000 plankton organisms on the surface of the ocean. What they do is that they kind of run around, they reproduce, they diffuse, they are swirled by the ocean. Let me go back. On the right side, as I play this again, what you see is the right macro stuff. I am not explaining to you what the right macro stuff is. I'm just telling you, read the paper of Tony, it's the pair correlation function. The basic idea is that on the left, you have something horrible, messy, chaotic, unpredictable. On the right-hand side, you get something that is smooth, looks like a nice partial differential equation evolving towards a steady state. If only you knew what the right macro statistics are, if you only knew how to write closed evolution equations in terms of the pair correlation function. So the idea is get data from the left and do the right, even if you don't have Tony telling you what is the right macro variable and how to derive the right macro equation. Maybe the most important thing is how do you figure out what the right macro variable is? If we have a detailed fine-scale simulation, how do you figure out what are the variables in terms of which we would write good macro models? And how do we typically get such variables? We either do it by, let's say, taking a moment, a set of moments from a distribution. We can do it by being very smart or very experienced about the problem, or we can do it by doing data mining from the data of the microscopic simulation. In our case here, our main tool in my group is rather diffusion maps rather than something else, because just this is something that we happen to be working on for several years. But of course, one could use all kinds of other data mining methods in order to determine good coarse variables. Typically for 130 years, people do principal components to get data reduction. Since 1991, to the best of my knowledge, there was a paper called nonlinear principal components, which is what we call today autoencoders. And then, of course, starting 2000 with the papers by the papers on isomap and local linear embedding, and then a little later by Rafi Koifman and his collaborators. I'm one of them on diffusion maps. The idea is to take complex data here, high-dimensional, three-dimensional data, but really living on a 2D manifold, and basically parametrizing this manifold by finding the right features in which to parameterize. This is not the point of my talk. The point of my talk is once you get the right variables, then you can try and learn evolution equations for these right variables. So this is an old paper from 1992. It has a horrible title, Discrete versus Continuous Time Nonlinear Signal Processing of Copper Electrode Dissolution Data. And what is the point of this paper? The point of this paper is, here is a bunch of experimental data that come from electrode dissolution of metals. What you see here is time series of the reaction rate, the rate of dissolution of the metal, as a parameter varies between the different time series. What changes is the potential difference between the metal and the reference electrode. And you see that at some situations you have a constant rate of dissolution, so the problem is a steady state. You have oscillations, you have period doubled oscillations, and later on you get all kinds of stuff. If you look at phase portrait reconstructions with time delays, you see steady states, limit cycles, period doublings, period quadruplings, and whatever. And the point was, we have data from a complex dynamical system. As a parameter varies, how can we derive models that are effective models by which we can study the bifurcations between these time series? And the interesting thing from that paper in 1992 is the construction of the thing that I want to show you on the right, which is a recurrent neural network. And this recurrent neural network is templated, what you see on the left, on an explicit fourth order Runge-Kutta. First thing that I want to point out to you, by now this is well known, but again, as I told you, I'll remind you that some of these things are known for a very long time, is that this recurrent network, and therefore the Runge-Kutta itself, the Runge-Kutta itself is, in a sense, a resnet, because what is learned by the network is not the right-hand side, but it is a perturbation of the identity. You see that in the Runge-Kutta itself, what happens at the next time step is what you have at the previous time step plus something. The other thing that I want you to notice when you look at this recurrent neural net from the early 1990s is that this recurrent net, which is a Runge-Kutta resnet, in addition, has a structure, for those of you that play with numerical methods, has a structure that is very much reminiscent of matrix-free Krylov methods. What do I mean by this? You take the current state and then you push it through the network, you get a result, and then look, you get the result, you multiply it with a known small number, the time step, you add it to the previous initial condition, and you pass it through the network again. That is, you calculate f of x, and then you calculate f of x plus epsilon f of x. That is, what you do is that you get enough data to estimate directional derivatives. And based on directional derivatives again and again and again, what you can do is that you estimate the action of the Jacobian and even the action of the Hessian of this unknown function. And so, in effect, what I'm trying to say very, very quickly is that both the Runge-Kutta integrator itself, but also this type of recurrent architecture is something that can be trained on discrete time data and, in effect, learn a good approximation of the right-hand side of the differential equation that would produce these discrete data. It's a type of backward error analysis. It's not exactly backward error analysis. It is one of the words that is used these days is inverse backward error analysis. Another word is mirror backward error analysis. But the basic idea is recurrent architectures and resnets not only have been used for a long time, but actually they are just incarnations of algorithms that we know and love, like Adams, Bashfords, and Runge-Kuttas. And indeed, the Resnet paper which came out in 2015, as we kind of all know today, is really just a forward Euler-based architecture. The thing that I wanted to say, and again, I am doing kind of this very quickly, this is a collaboration with a bunch of people in Aachen, is the following. Remember that I told you that you get an X and you pass it through a function F or through a black box neural network. Then you get the result, you add it to the previous initial condition times maybe a small constant, and then you pass it through F again. And you take that and pass it again. I am not doing justice to this, but as I already told you, by doing these successive X, F of X plus a small perturbation times F of X, and again and again and again, this recurrent architecture basically is doing estimations of directional derivatives. And by doing several directional derivatives, what it does is that it actually estimates a Taylor series for the time trajectory of the function. And so overall, you might think that such an architecture that is recurrent and has many copies of the same F, but is designed in such a way so that it allows you the estimation of the action of the Jacobian of your operator, the action of the Hessian of your operator, ultimately is something that you can think of it as a sort of, as I'm saying at the top, a basic Krylov type architecture superstructure. That is, it is capable of being able to fit algorithms that are integrators, being able to fit algorithms that look like fixed point solvers. Most of the numerical algorithms that come from differentiable, if you want, calculations and Taylor series, they can be encompassed by such an architecture. And so the fun part is, if you know the architecture, then you can learn the right-hand side of the equations. But if you have a bunch of right-hand side equations, then you don't learn the black box network. What you do is that you learn the architecture that would integrate these equations, or the architecture that would find fixed point solvers for these equations. So bottom line of the stuff is that these recurrent network evaluations, by in effect doing Krylov type approximations of the action of the Jacobian and Hessian of the model that you're working with, they can be used to either learn the model if you have the architecture, or to do a sort of meta learning, train the architecture so that it becomes a solver for a class of models, train the architecture so that it becomes an integrator for a class of models. So again, the bottom line, if you want, is that if you play with matrix-free iterative numerical algorithms like Newton-Krylov GMRS, you can kind of immediately see that some of these nice architectures that have been found as being very useful on the neural network side, they already have been there for quite some time in the numerical analysis that we know and love. In this particular case, using such an architecture, we were able to learn the right-hand side depending on a parameter, and what you're supposed to see here is a bifurcation diagram based on the time series. You can see that there was a steady state that gave, we have the Hopf bifurcation, became a limit cycle, period doubled. The important thing again here is that it is possible to estimate the right-hand side of the equations. And for those of you that play with dynamical systems, the reason that this is important is that you may know that the bifurcations of discrete time problems are completely different qualitatively from the bifurcations of continuous time right-hand sides. So the ODEs have limit cycles, but discrete maps have invariant circles. So most of the times in which people do neural network approximations of time-one maps of dynamical systems, while the approximation for short times can be wonderful, the long time attractors are actually qualitatively wrong. Based on, again, numerical analysis algorithms, we worked back then with a bunch of other architectures. What you see here is a different kind of recurrent network, an implicit network, which really is an implementation of Crank-Nicholson, or the trapezoidal rule. And again, in the 90s, we worked, and other people also worked on how to train these things. What is, of course, very different now than then is automatic differentiation, which makes things immensely easier. Let me mention a couple of other things that are interesting in the marriage of neural networks and numerical algorithms. Discrete time integrators are non-invertible, and therefore when you train neural networks to discrete time data, they are also non-invertible. And that's something that we studied also back then. Let me not go into details. And the other thing that was quite interesting at the time is what might be called gray box or physics informed, but in a different way. Model learning. Let's say that you have a differential equation in which a whole bunch of terms are known, but the red one is not known, then it is easy to use this kind of integrator-based architectures to hardwire the parts that you know and only learn the parts that you do not know. This is old stuff from the 90s. Let me just mention something slightly more recent. What you see here is something that is a current submission to NIPS, which is the same idea, but now learning not ordinary differential equations, but stochastic differential equations. You create a recurrent architecture in which instead of learning the right-hand side of a differential equation, you learn, as you see here, the drift and the diffusivity of a stochastic differential equation. And of course, the important thing is how do you create the right loss for such a problem? And you do it based on using established numerical integrators for stochastic differential equations, like we've used Euler-Maruyamas and Milsteins and Hoynes, in the same way that Runge-Kutta would give you a neural network architecture and other integrators for initial value problems. Also, simulators for stochastic differential equations allow you to create architectures for neural networks that learn to approximate stochastic differential equations. And this can be used both for actually having data from stochastic differential equations, or remember I told you that we're interested in problems that come usually from StatMech. You can have various lattice kinetic Monte Carlo simulations, which we know at some limit that they can be closed in terms of stochastic differential equations for order parameters. We can get data from the lattice simulations and learn the effective stochastic differential equations. Another thing that we used to do back then is not only to learn the right-hand sides of ODEs from data, but also to learn the right-hand side operators of evolutionary partial differential equations from data. The idea is very straightforward, and again, it's fashionable again today. The partial derivative with respect to time, think of a parabolic equation, is a function of a number of local spatial derivatives. So the idea is, and that is what we did back then, is to take finite difference stencils, use finite differences to estimate spatial derivatives, and then train neural networks to estimate the right-hand side of differential equations. It should be straightforward. And again, now it's well known that if you work on a stencil and then the nearby shifted stencil and then the nearby shifted stencil, so if you work with a translationally invariant partial differential equation, then in effect you are doing convolutional neural networks. So again, I would like to kind of think that ideas like convolutional neural networks that have been wonderfully useful in new contexts since then are really already there in the traditional differential equation numerical analysis that we know and love, in this case, finite difference stencils. We use this and combine the, if you want, the convolutional neural networks by shifting stencils with the recurrent neural networks in time to learn and solve partial differential equations. And so there are papers from 1998 for doing burgers and the Kuramoto-Sivashinsky, that is, get data from simulations, learn the partial differential equation, a right-hand side operator, and then pass it to a solver so that you could reproduce the evolution in time. Let me tell you something more cute or interesting or whatever that comes from that more in more recent years. Let's say that you have, again, a microscopic simulation. So let's say an agent-based simulation or a lattice-Boltzmann simulation. You want to learn the partial differential equation at the macroscopic level. What you do is that you run the micro simulation, observe macro, and then use the data to learn the macro PDE. Let me give you a little example that comes from chemotaxis. You may know or have heard about very interesting details on how, let's say, E. coli swim based on their flagella. They typically have up to 6. And these flagella are, if they work together in a counterclockwise rotation, then the cell is moving. If they do not synchronize, but go clockwise, then the cell kind of tumbles. So what the cell does is that it goes between tumbling and running. In one dimension, cells go to the right, cells go to the left, or they just stay at the same time and tumble. So what I'm going to show you is just results of what happens if you put some cells like that, 6,000 cells to be exact, in a gradient of food. Again, the whole point is you run micro and you learn a macro PDE. So what you see here, just so that you have a feeling, what you see here is the green is the food. So the cells, which are the blue, they want to go to where there is more food, which is the green. What you see on the left is 5,000 cells. And what you see in the middle is the observations at the macro level of the 5,000 cells. The red, which is not visible now, but let me run it so that you can see it. The red is the observation of the fine scale evolution. The blue is actually the evolution of the partial differential equation that we learned this way. And when you see on the right these little yellow, green, and blue, this has to do with whether the cells are running to the left, they're running to the right, or whether they're tumbling. And you can do this also in a gray box form. That is, if you know everything but the chemotactic term, then instead of learning the whole PDE, you can learn only the chemotactic term. So more or less what I've told you up to now is that there's a whole bunch of things that come from traditional numerical analysis that can give rise to neural network architectures that identify nonlinear dynamical systems. Let me tell you something that I would like to think is more fun. In what I showed you up to now, we kind of knew what is the space and the time. We just didn't know what the right macroscopic variables and operators were. But let me show you a little motivating example. 2011, DARPA had what you call a shredding context. What they did is that they took a bunch of documents, shredded them, and asked people to put them back together again. Let me tell you this in the context of dynamical systems. Here is a partial differential equation in one dimension in space plus time. These are the spatiotemporal patterns. What you do is that you take this PDE, you pass it through a shredder, you just shred the page, you get a whole bunch of time series, you mix up these time series, it looks like crap, but if you do the right data mining, then you can kind of put back together the space again. So the idea is, if you have spatiotemporal evolution, but you don't have space labels, you can use data mining to recover a space which is topologically the same and is one-to-one within a diffeomorphism from the true space from which the problem comes from. This is the same idea in 2 dimensions. You have a 2-dimensional partial differential equation plus time. You take this and shred it in time series. You lose the X and Y locations. But if you do data mining with these time series, you can recover an emergent embedding space, which is one-to-one with the original one. And then you can learn the partial differential equation in there. So let me show you an example. Here is 800 oscillators. This comes from work of Strogac many years ago, 20 or so. If you run them, so here they are all, you're going to see them run, they're all colored magically because I know how to color them. You will see that if you run them, they organize themselves along a one-dimensional curve, and then they evolve while retaining this one-dimensional spatial topology. But this is a space that didn't exist before. It's a space that comes from the guys evolving in a coupled way. If you plot them in terms of this emergent coordinate, which I here call omega, you will see that the solution looks like a partial differential equation. This is the radius and the angle of the oscillators as they evolve. So the idea is that you have a whole bunch of agents, they're running around coupled to each other, but out of their own dynamics comes an emergent space in which you do have a partial differential equation, or it appears as if you do. Let me show you another example. It's exactly the same type of model. You have a whole bunch of oscillators, you let them run, and then you see that they organize themselves. Every point down there on the floor is an oscillator. You look at them in the right variable, then they look like a partial differential equation evolving, and that's what you also see here. So what we do is that we run this example. You look at all of these oscillators evolving and organizing themselves together. What we do is that we don't color them by where they started, but we color them by where they find themselves along this emergent one-dimensional space. And what this corresponds to is having a whole bunch of different coupled things. They look like a mesh of spaghetti. But if you put them together, you do the right data mining and put them together the right way, then they look like a partial differential equation. And so we take the data and we learn how to put them in the right emergent space. And then what we do is that we learn the partial differential equation in this emergent spatial direction and time. We can do bifurcation analysis of these things and so on and so forth. This is not so much the important thing. The important thing that I do want to convey, and this is the same problem, and now the oscillators are a much more complicated set of oscillators. So they organize themselves along a two-dimensional space. And so we learn a two-dimensional partial differential equation. And what you see here on the left is the oscillators numbered by 1 to 1,000, and they kind of just run around in a mesh. But if you look at them in the right organized space, phi1 and phi2, which emerged from data mining the simulations, then they do look as if they're evolving on a two-dimensional surface. So they look like a discretization of a manifold. Here is another example of the same thing in something that has to do with computational neuroscience. You have 1,200 oscillators, 1,024 oscillators. They are heterogeneous, they are coupled. This has something to do with the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's not so important. It's a messy network. What you do is that you observe them running around. Each one does a slightly different oscillation because they're different in their kinetics and they're different in how they're coupled. But if you do data mining, you realize that there is a two-parameter family of oscillations. And therefore, if you plot them not as oscillator 1, oscillator 2, oscillator 1,000, but you plot them in these emergent coordinates, then you see that the evolution looks like a smooth field evolution, and we can learn partial differential equations for this evolution. So the idea is that you can have very messy agent-based stuff and then be able to find the right transformation that would make it into a smooth evolving field. And the last thing that I'm going to tell you in terms of new directions along these lines, I told you that one can take problems and learn partial differential equations from data. So this is the Kuromoto-Shevashinsky in one spatial dimension and time. Let's say that we have data in this corridor and we can have data in this corridor. The idea is that we can use the data in these corridors to learn the equation, and then we can use the learned equation to in-paint, to fill in what happens in the middle. And so it is possible, as I'm saying here, we can call this in-painting. Yes. And so the last thing that I really want to tell you is, how do we figure out when this process is well posed? And you take this problem and you learn the partial differential equation in the space-time concept, then you try and solve them in a larger domain. In the place where the problem is well defined, always get the same solution. But in the place in which the problem is not well posed, then every time that you solve, you're going to get a different solution. The other thing is that it is possible to use machine learning in order to be able to figure out where is it that the problem is well posed and where the problem is ill posed. Here, and this is the last thing that I'm going to tell you, is a wave equation. And let's say that I have data for this wave equation in this corridor. You will know, if you remember your characteristics, that if I have data in such a domain, then there exists this kind of pyramidal domain based on the characteristics where the solution is defined. And outside that, it's not defined. So if we solve this problem many, many times, we will find always the same solution in this domain and different solutions out here. If we have reflective boundary conditions, you can convince yourself that if you prescribe data in this domain, then the solution is prescribed in the blue regions and not prescribed outside. Indeed, if you learn the PDE and solve it in that domain, you're going to find that every time you solve, you get the same thing in the blue region, but something different in the yellow region. So the idea is that it is possible to both learn and solve partial differential equations to do in painting. And it is also possible to at least start probing when is the in-painting problem a well-defined one and when it is an ill-posed one. And I wanted to say also a few other things, but let me kind of stop sharing here and maybe just summarize by saying that the thing that, one of the things that I wanted to say, which as I said, a lot of people know, is that I think a lot of the architectures that have been discovered as successful in many contexts, they are part of the numerical analysis we know and love. And the last thing that I kind of wanted to say is that Machine learning allows us to make transformations of problems to other problems, and this is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting things. How is it that we can use machine learning to understand that this partial differential equation and that partial differential equation are just two different observations of the same thing? So doing gauge invariant data mining, doing data mining that are invariant to diffeomorphisms is something that I think is important and will also affect a lot the way that we make numerical algorithms with neural network architectures. Sorry that this latter part was a bit more like an advertisement. Thank you. Sorry I ran over. That's it.
Thank you very much. So do we have one quick question? We're a little over time. If not, please join me in thanking Ioannis again for the talk.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks very much.